Have you noticed that politicians struggle to enact the things they run on? That regardless of who wins elections, lawmakers cannot pass whatever legislation they like. They find themselves bound by what is popular, or at least their sense of it. They can only act within a narrow set of ideas, and that range is called the Overton Window. And on the Overton Window podcast, we look at issues around the country and talk to the people who change what is politically possible. Now, today we're going to talk about judgment. We are citizens in a republic, and our voice matters. But how do we exercise that voice? How do we know what benefits the public? So today I'm going to talk with Patrick McIlheran, the Director of Policy at the Wisconsin Free Market Badger Institute, about the question he faced about citizen-led initiative and referendum. Pat, welcome.
Thanks, James.
What's the question you're facing?
The question we're facing is whether Wisconsin should do as Michigan and more notoriously California has done, which is begin initiating legislation through referendums, rather than letting the legislature be the as the Constitution specifies the lawmaking body.
Mm-hmm. Why are you considering this question now?
We're considering it because the governor brought it up. Wisconsin is one of those states with a Republican-controlled legislature and a Democrat in the governor's office. Governor Tony Evers has been there since he won in 2018, and he has every moment of that tenure faced a Republican majority in the legislature, a fairly strong one, in fact. They were almost veto-proof for a number of the years, and the governor's quite frustrated, you can tell, because the legislature is doing what Republican legislatures do, pursuing Republican ideas about the size and scope of government, and not pursuing the bluntly really progressive edge that Governor Evers has. He has an expansive view of government. He wants Wisconsin government to do a lot more. He wants taxpayer-funded child care, among other things. This, that, and the other. He wants protection for the unborn to be repealed, and he's just not selling the ideas to the legislature. He has not succeeded at that, and so he's looking to work around them.
So this is there is a partisan story to be told here, which is a Democratic executive with a Republican legislature who wants to pass progressive ideas. The only way to do that is through citizen-led initiative, which doesn't require the legislature.
That's right, and that's the key thing. He has been portraying this, and this has happened before. A couple of years ago, the governor also brought this idea up. He's bringing it up again, and in each case, he is portraying it as a matter of, do the people have a voice in making laws? And the correct answer, the reflexive answer from more or less free market libertarianish conservatives like at Badger Institute, why, yes, the people do have a voice. It's called the legislature. They elect them. Mm-hmm. But I think what the governor is getting at is, can a concentrated, enthusiastic leftist majority in a few places, it's concentrated in a few places, and frankly, that's part of the geography of Wisconsin, long has been, is that a disproportionate share of the Democrats' statewide vote comes from Madison and Milwaukee, a few other college towns, but numerically, it's Dane County and Milwaukee County. That's chiefly where it is, whereas the Republican vote tends to be more disparate, more spread out across the state.
Which is a natural feature in many states. Urban places tend to go one way, and rural places tend to go another.
Well, and this is just in the nature of the current coalitions, I guess you'd call it. The way things are now, it was not this way, say, a century ago. Historians will tell you, but okay, so that's how it is now. And for this, we would uproot the Constitution, Wisconsin's interesting. It's one of the, I gather we were one of the few states to still be operating under our original Constitution. We've never had a wholesale rewrite of it. What we got is from 1848, amended cautiously and a number of times over the years, but it seems to work fairly well, and it seems to work under a variety of circumstances. So I'm not clear whether it's worth ripping it up. That's why I gave a jingle over to Mackinac to see what Michigan's experience had been, and it was what struck me was that you were not immediately making retching sounds at the time.
Yes, some of my favorite pieces of policy right now came through constitutional initiative and amendments,
But
that were led by citizens.
But neither were you enthusing that this is the way to go.
Yeah.
That this is a guarantee of more representative and superior governance.
Yes, some of my least favorite pieces of public policy also come from citizen-led initiative and referendum.
Trade-offs.
Yes, but that's actually what I wanted to talk with you about, because you've told us a partisan story for why the governor wants this. But there's more than a partisan story here, because it does go back to questions of what is the citizen's role. Yes, I absolutely agree. We elect legislators to legislate on behalf of our interests. But a lot of states have said that, or have noticed a feature, that legislators are creatures of politics. They have their own incentive, and sometimes they will refuse to enact popular policy for political reasons. And so therefore, states like Michigan, like California, like a number of other places have said that there should be some type of activity that citizens can do to give them direct access to ballot questions, to give them direct legislative authority, which will only be enacted if the legislation that they come up with has the support of the people, but they do have direct ability to legislate. So that's kind of the question. That's the question, or at least that's the most positive access for why, or explanation for why states have these citizen initiative. How are you weighing this question?
It was interesting when we talked. You brought up a very old use of the referendum in Michigan, and that was whether to permit the sale of oleomargarine, as it be called. Now everybody just says margarine because it's an accustomed thing, but as of, I want to say 1970, it was still illegal to sell artificially colored oleomargarine in Wisconsin. As you might imagine, being the dairy state, dairy interests opposed the sale of this competitor to butter. And so you had Wisconsinites driving off to grocery stores right across the Illinois line where they could get margarine that was yellow from the get-go. They could spread it on their toast in the morning without ripping up the bread. All right, eventually the legislature saw the light and decided that protecting farmers by essentially making the competing margarine repulsive was out of the question, and the law was reformed. That happened without a referendum. It did happen with a public outcry. And I think it's an old example, but it's an illustration of what we've got going here. Legislatures are responsive to public pressure. I mean, that's the point, right? They're meant to be representative government. You have 132 antennae in Madison attuned to what the public wants and does not want. In part, the governor, again, and here's the thing. It's not like this particular alignment of a Republican majority in the legislature and a Democrat governor is a natural thing. With recent decades, we've had an immensely popular Republican governor, Tommy Thompson, won 4 terms. I mean, nobody else has done that. The guy mopped the floor with Democrat opponents during his reelection. He was immensely popular on a statewide basis. Meanwhile, he faced Democrat majorities in the legislature. So it isn't as if this is some hypothetical. It's a very real thing that these polarities between governor and legislature can shift.
I want to talk about that because I think that's an important point. Is that right now the governor is doing this because he thinks that this gives him a partisan advantage to pass policy that the legislature would not act. You're bringing up the point that like this situation isn't going to be the same forever. If we change the Constitution to allow for initiative and referendum, this is going to be a power that is going to be entrenched in the state constitution. It's going to be tough to get back. So the question that you have is not who best serves the partisan interest right now, but is this good for Wisconsinites over the long term?
And here's where we get down to the other bit. Right now, part of what's motivating the governor is that the legislature also is frustrated. They have a hard time getting popular ideas past a governor who is, and it seems like, to them at any rate, an almost reflexive no, an almost reflexive veto, which they cannot override given the current split of majorities in the Assembly and the Senate. They can, however, begin an initiative or a referendum process for constitutional amendments. In Wisconsin, like in other states, amendments are proposed. They pass both houses of the legislature 2 successive sessions, and then they go to the people for a vote. Well, that's unfair, says the governor. Why does the legislature get to propose ideas like, for instance, this upcoming spring election, voters will be asked whether they ought to put voter ID requirements into the state constitution. They're in statute right now, but the legislature is pretty clear that that could change at any moment. The state Supreme Court is likely to take up a case that's trying to get voter ID, which has been around for well over a decade, overturned. So the legislature wants to encode it into the Constitution. Is that a question that arises to the level that a Constitution should be at? I don't know. That's kind of that's on the line. But all right, this is their decision.
The Constitution trusts the legislators to make that decision.
Yes. They're the ones who get to make that decision.
But and then voters too, of course.
They share it with voters.
Yes.
That's the deal. Everybody needs an editor, right? Doesn't matter how well you write, you need an editor. So too it is with laws. Every law, every proposed legislation has to pass 2 gates. Yes, usually it's the legislature, and even in there, you got to pass both houses, but then the governor as well. The old joke in Wisconsin is then it also has to pass the 3rd test, which is not being overturned by a Dane County judge, by those who are upset at what the Republican legislature has passed. But let's leave that out of the question. At least constitutionally speaking, a law must pass at least 2 gates, the legislature and the governor. Even with a constitutional amendment, it has to pass the legislature 2 successive sessions, and then the people has to win in a statewide referendum. So again, there's checks and balances to get down to the Schoolhouse Rock version of it, but you have to get people to agree. It's not just a univocal or unilateral action that can institute law. In part, that's what the governor is proposing here for statute, which is that you get enough enthusiasts or a well-funded campaign to put something on the ballot, and then it's up to the people. And once it passes, that's it. I thought it was interesting that I was hearing from a number of people that part of the problem is once statute is enacted by referendum, it can be very hard to change. Both sometimes statutorily, it has to be, I believe in California, for instance, it can only be changed by another referendum. But also in theory, I mean, what kind of legislature is going to have the chutzpah to say, yes, the people have already spoken, and thus it can be said, spoken conclusively on what statute should be, but we're going to go change it. I mean, this brings up legitimacy questions. And I don't think that that's a natural or good part of the constitutional order here.
That's true, although I will provide that is one way the initiatives can work. It is not the only way that initiatives can work. I think in the state of Michigan, if you're trying to initiate a statutory change, you get enough signatures, and then it goes before the legislature. It solves that problem that we talked about. Sometimes legislators just don't want to deal with an issue. And legislators at that point have a chance to enact that statute themselves. So it doesn't go on the ballot. And if they do, then they get to keep and maintain control over it. There are no special voting requirements. But if it does go on the ballot, and it is approved by voters, then it's extreme amendment requirement or extreme voting requirements in order to amend it. Believe it's 3/4 in both chambers, which is even bigger than supermajorities. And they did this because they did not want citizens doing direct legislation. They did think that it was the legislature's job to do this, or to write statutes. They want to ensure that legislators maintain control over the statutes, but they also recognize that there are some things that are popular and good policies that legislators won't touch. So that being said, I'm not saying that's the exact way to do it, because there, as some of Michigan's current paid leave and minimum wage debates that are going on right now in Michigan show that even that setup has some problems too, or raises some issues about governance and popularity. But while you're right, I did just want to say, it's like, if you are looking for two gatekeepers for initiated legislation, you can get that if you want. There are a couple of ways of doing this. But to your point, I guess, what do you think is the overall principle that you are trying to weigh on this question? Because we've talked about a couple of one, which is the problems of popularity in public policy. The oleomargarine demonstrates that special interests can control public policy for their thing, but an experience in Michigan and Wisconsin says that can be changed with initiative, and it can be changed without initiative. Although I will say that I believe that Michigan was a decade ahead of Wisconsin in changing that, but the politics are also different.
Right. Yeah. And that's interesting in that the politics were of the opposite polarity in Michigan for some of that 1990s period as well. So these things flip back and forth. Part of the instinct, I think, here going in is just a certain caution. Don't go making deep changes unless you're certain of what the effects are going to be. And it was striking to me, especially what I was hearing out of California, but to some extent in Michigan as well, that the initiative process for legislating, it's portrayed by our governor, for instance, but by other proponents as being more authentically democratic. Here are the people petitioning for change, which all sounds grand, which sounds in a civic textbook way sort of perfect. But in practice, what it means is that you have to have a cause that is championed by some particular organized interest. And it's incredibly difficult to organize previously unorganized people around a new idea. That's what made the 2010 Tea Party movement so unique. It's one of the few times where there was that sort of spontaneous organization, to the extent there was. Most of the time, a successful legislative referendum, especially in California where it happens a lot, is an idea that already is being pushed by a pre-existing organized group, one that has a lot of money, and one that has access to a lot of people to help knock on doors and hold clipboards out for people to sign on.
Make sure that the lawyers approve the petitions so that it's legally valid, yes.
You got to go get the legal help first before you get this thing going.
By the way, in the state of Michigan, one petition was rejected because a judge looked at it and said, I don't think that's the right font size. And it might not have been. I'm not sure.
So good luck, peasants, in storming the castle. I mean, we would all like to think of it that way, we, the people legislating, but oftentimes it's them, the teachers union, legislating, for instance, or halting the legislation, or uh, demanding this or that. But either way, it's an organized interest, and it costs a lot of money to promote a yes vote on the on whatever referendum it is. So yeah, it's a process that advantages those who already are an organized interest with access to money, to media, to attention, to volunteers. And that is that's how politics works right now, but we already have a system that we understand, and we know where the how the special interests work. You know which direction to look for the threat. Here, it's the newness of the method, at least in Wisconsin, and the sort of pristine myth about it's we the people acting tends to insulate it from a good and proper skepticism about how this stuff is coming about and why it's being forwarded.
Which is to say that you've looked at the initiatives around the country and you have seen that it is not your typical citizens who get access to the ballot converged around a popular piece of policy that lawmakers have refused to touch, but rather the typical spending interests who are trying to weigh public policy in their favor, try to get legal advantages. And they're the ones who can pay signature gatherers, lawyers, and the rest of the people to get that ballot access, and therefore weigh public policy more in their favor. Although I will say, again, even with that setup, they have to be able to convince lawmakers to approve what they ask, or to get voters to approve what they ask. Like, even if it is a special favor that benefits someone at the public's expense, the public has to vote for it. And that does open. So what I would say is that opens the initiative and referendum in general, opens the Overton window, because it is going to give some people the ability to directly ask the public ballot questions that the legislature refuses to ask. Some of those are going to be good, some of those are going to be bad, but the counterweight is still popular policy. Voters still remain in charge. I think it can get kind of messy when you're asking people to change the Constitution, change statutes outside of the general election, where we're asking for the most voter participation, or it's more likely to get the most voter participation. But it's still, people are in charge. Popular policy is the thing that matters to whether these proposals are enacted, even if they are special interests asking for favors.
And you never really want to. Here's the thing: I don't want to make it sound like I have something against mobs with pitchforks and torches. Happily saw a mob of taxpayers with metaphorical pitchforks and theoretical torches alter the course of Wisconsin in 2010, electing a Republican majority, electing a Republican governor, who went and did crazy things, saying, maybe the unions ought not to be running the state and we should have some labor reforms. To which the normal old line response of somebody who'd been in Madison a long time was, "You can't do that." Oh, yes, they did. They passed Act 10. It survived 100,000 people protesting outside the Capitol because it was an initiative backed by a legislature and a governor who had been put there by approximately, 2 million people, 2 million voters. So that weird ideas can get elected and that the aftermath can look very messy. Yeah, okay, that happens. I do think that there is room in the existing process for that. We see that. Uh, Whatever you think of the Donald Trump phenomenon, it is undeniable that that constitutes a bit of a revolution inside conservatism, inside the Republican Party specifically, as to what kind of priorities are going to be embraced. Okay, well, yeah, there was an inter-Republican, an inter-conservative argument over what the shape of conservative policy will be, and yeah, that Overton window got dragged around quite a bit. But again, that's working within the system. I do have sympathy for that. You're making what I think is the strongest case for a legislating by initiative process, which is when both sides of a political spectrum have managed to have been captured by, might be different arguments, in favor of an incumbent policy or a policy that helps this or that rent seeker or cluster of rent seekers, but they've managed to come up with a Republican argument in favor of it and a Democrat argument in favor of it, and there we sit without margarine available in the state, or without, in the case of Michigan, you were mentioning that one of the struggles is whether there's going to be a school choice program. That was an argument here, although it happened long ago. There was an argument to conservatives and Republicans, chiefly outstate, chiefly in smaller communities, that, oh, this is going to ruin your community. It'll take away your high school. Okay, well, that's that was an argument that worked. It doesn't work anymore. It stopped working after a while, and school choice won the day on a statewide basis. It's not safe, but at least it's
an option that wasn't constitutionally eliminated through the ballot box.
Yes, and it managed to change the political culture in the state to strengthen its to solidify its existence. These things can happen, and that, along with some other things, were very much a we the people sort of process. It's a little tougher, though. I agree. It's I heard somebody referring to, and it might have been you, what's at stake here is the ability of outsiders to call the question, which that's a valuable thing. I agree.
Yeah, or say people outside of the political process. I mean, just the initiative and signature gathering efforts does require, valid citizens, valid voters to endorse a subject, and of course, it has to be approved by the majority of the electorate. But it does allow outside groups as well, as in someone who is interested in, pick your interest, pick your group. Expanding school choice in Michigan or abortion in another state. If these are interests that they want, outside groups can come in, pay for signature gatherers, pay for marketing campaigns, call a ballot question, but they can also lobby legislators too. They can engage their political voice as well through the legislative process outside of the ballot access. So, you can't keep outsiders out of politics because they're citizens too, and they have as much freedom of speech as everyone else.
And especially on the state level, especially in a middling-sized state like Wisconsin, we're considerably smaller than Michigan is. 5.8 million people. Your average county party apparatus is half a dozen people at the meetings on a regular basis, other than very large places. So there is room for a sort of a homemade show up and change it yourself feel to some of these things. And remember, the part of the charm of the whole, you'll hear occasionally critics grumbling that we're locked into a two-party system. And boy, howdy, if only there were like 5 or 8 parties, we could be like Finland or something. Um, but part of the deal on that coalitional way of doing things is that it tends to politicize things. And I mean this in a good way. You mentioned, for instance, the not to go back to the margarine, but what was the problem with the margarine issue? Why was margarine illicit? Because it hadn't been politicized. It wasn't a political point of contention for a long time. Everybody was against it, or at least everybody who had the power to do something about it. They were elected. The outsiders were the Milwaukeeans traipsing off to Illinois to buy margarine. It eventually became politicized in the sense that one party saw an opportunity to take up an issue opposite the other one. And this happens. People talk about everything being politicized, and I get that that's, in one sense, a bad thing, but also there's the upside way of looking at that, in that if an issue is locked into a unanimity in the political process that displeases a significant number of people who wish that we would talk about it, well, eventually one side in that political duopoly will see advantage in, okay, we'll take up the issue. We'll listen to you.
Mm-hmm. Well, which is what you're describing is honestly populism. Populism as a political strategy is the strategy where we have a two-party system, and if for whatever reason, if one side or the other does not endorse popular policy, then there are political benefits from taking that policy position. Not because it's a good position, although it might be, not because it's a bad position, although it might be, but rather there is a large contingent of citizens with political power who do not see that anyone is taking up that idea. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about why your voice matters. So this is, again, you've explained a partisan reason why the governor wants citizen-led initiatives and referenda, and you've kind of discussed the virtues, the vices, the problems, and the resources for it. But do you think if you came out of this and said, there are some temporary political reasons why you shouldn't give the governor this power, but in the long run, it's good for the state, would that have mattered?
Maybe. Badger is one of a number of policy research groups on the right in Wisconsin. We're the one that's full of old journalists. There's another Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, which is full of lawyers. They sue for a living. We tell stories. There are a couple of others, each with their niche, and we're one of those. Why it matters? Because I think we need to move this past. The idea was rejected immediately, out of hand by the state legislature, because they saw through it for what it was. It was the governor just
wanting progressive policies that the legislature didn't want. Yes,
right. Which, okay, buzz off. But there needs to be a deeper consideration of it. What are the reasons? Is it good or bad on the whole? Well, let's find some. So that's what we did.
Mm-hmm. So I want to push back, or at least give you more credit, because I do think for these major questions of state importance, this is a major structural change. This is something that states have experimented with mixed results, and with a complex legacy, with virtuous ideas for why it's there, and complicated follow through in practice. But the way that you get major changes, the way that you can get major improvements, is by taking ideas seriously, especially when they deal with things that are across the aisle. When you can agree with progressives that we do, or at least in this case, if you could have gotten to the point where it's like, yes, we don't really want to talk about current policy, but for the long term, we think that this is a positive thing for the state. This will produce public benefits. It's not just a partisan issue. We can see there's reasons to come together. That's how you get major changes. It's by persuading your fellow person or persuading your fellow citizens, treating them as neighbors to be persuaded rather than obstacles to be overcome. And partisan politics encourages you to treat your fellow citizen as an obstacle to overcome.
Sure.
But when you talk about policy, when you talk about the futures, when you talk about these structures, you can have a legitimate conversation. And by convincing each other, you can shift the Overton window.
That is true. That is true. That's a good point. And there needs to be more of that give and take, given that, especially on a state level, a lot of the policy that we're talking about involves mechanics. All of us agree on clean water and clean air. The question is how you achieve it, how you most effectively. Nobody wants to chase away industry. Nobody wants to see factories moving off to Alabama or China or what have you. We all want them to stay here and grow here. The question is how you effectively do that. So yeah, it's a good point. We do need to talk to each other. We do need to come to some sort of agreement. I mentioned this. I mentioned him before, Tommy Thompson, the effective four-term governor, and bluntly, he expanded the size of Wisconsin's government more than my taste would have. But I wasn't the governor; he was, and a great many Wisconsins were evidently and quite in favor of that. So he was good at making deals, and in the end, making a deal amounts to, well, what is it you really need on your side, and what do we really need, and let's come to something. I will say this: part of the, and here's the fascinating thing: the Michigan approach to referendum, especially the idea that if you can get enough citizens to want to put a statute on the ballot, it really puts it before the legislature with a red flashing warning. This is going to happen. See if you could do something about it. This seems to contrast a bit with California's approach, which doesn't really involve a legislative option or doesn't give the legislature a crack at it. To the extent that it's putting proposed legislature in front of the legislature, it's using the mechanisms for refining a law, a potential law, the hearings, well, why don't you'll get what are interest groups showing up and then presenting legitimate objections as to here's why that's not going to work. For instance, I believe there was an immensely popular victims' rights idea that was rushing its way through the Wisconsin legislature a few years ago. I was hearing this from some people. They were pointing this as an example, and it very much was propelled on that feeling of we the people want this. By golly, the legislature was going to hop to it. Well, they started holding hearings, and public defenders and prosecutors both showed up. Again, very specialized interests, to be sure, but they were pointing out, here's why it's not going to work. You didn't see this, did you? And they were making a legitimate objections. They were finding the pits along the pathway. So the legislature was able to change it. It's a slightly different thing than a referendum, of course, but it's the same idea that let's slow down and vet this. There's an advantage to not moving quickly, even on what should be what's an absolutely great idea. Well, it turns out there are unforeseen consequences. To the extent that legislation happens slowly, even in those cases where everybody's shouting, there ought to be a law. Well, yeah, but maybe not, or maybe it should be a law that's a bit different than anyone conceived before.
All right, Patrick, I hope you're exercising good judgment in your attempts to shift the Overton window.